Hello everyone, I'm Matthew Taylor, Chief Executive of the RSA. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's special event. Before we begin, could you make sure your mobile phone is switched to silent? We're live streaming tonight's event as usual, so welcome to all our web viewers. A reminder that the hashtag tonight is RSA Charity, if you want to be involved in the discussion on Twitter. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce this evening's event, which is organised in partnership with New Philanthropy Capital. I'm delighted to welcome my old friend Dan Corrie, who's Chief Executive of NPC. NPC was described recently in the Financial Times as having, quote, sharp analytical and financial instincts advising charities and philanthropists, nowadays combined with think-tankery on the not-for-profit sector. Dan joined the organisation's Chief Executive in 2011 following a varied career in public policy and economics. He's been advisor to Downing Street and to the Treasury and was a director in the economics segment of FTI Consulting. Dan joins us today to explore how we can increase impact, effectiveness and productivity in the charity sector. I'm also delighted to welcome two great respondents who are going to speak after Dan's speech. Lucy de Groot, who's Chief Executive of CSV, Community Service Volunteers, and Vicky Price, Chief Economic Advisor at the CEBR, which is the Centre for Economics and Business Research. And as I say, they all respond to Dan's speech. After we hear from Dan, I'll be inviting Lucy and Vicky to join us on stage. And also, as a special bonus tonight, I hope you'll stay on afterwards to continue the discussion, because we are delighted to be having a drinks reception, which has been generously sponsored by Odgers Bernston. So please do stay on and carry on the conversation. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dan Corrie.
Thanks a lot, Matthew, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. Imagine you have a sector with an annual income of £60 billion, and nobody really knows what it achieves or scrutinises it very much. And then imagine it is made up of 160,000 registered bodies, many enjoying rather handy tax breaks, who are equally under-scrutinised and employ over 700,000 people. You might be a bit taken aback. Well, this is, broadly speaking, the charity sector. And this evening I want to talk about why it is left so much to its own devices and whether there is anything we can do about it, drawing on the way things work in the private and the public sector. And I'll touch on perhaps a more controversial topic, which is whether we should do anything about that. Now, everyone involved in the not-for-profit or charity sector is driven by a sense of mission and passion. That is what makes it such an exciting and worthwhile place to be. We all give money to charity for the same reason. We want to do good. We donate the proceeds of our company, now sold as we go into retirement, or money from our family inheritance. We give a £5 by standing order once a month, or sign up for a sponsored cycle ride. We need not do it. A similar thing applies to those setting up or working for charities and voluntary groups. Many could be doing something else, or enjoying more leisure time, or getting paid better in public or private sector job. Yes, many in the voluntary sector get paid, which some diehards feel lets the side down. But very few are involved to maximise profits, improve share prices, or earn as much as they can. Now, of course, this is not the story everywhere. There are those who give to increase their chances of meeting Prince Charles or to get a knighthood, those who are corrupt or looking for tax advantages, and those who run what I increasingly call business charities, where social purpose is one among other objectives. But these are the exceptions. For most, it is about passion, mission, and doing good, and what fantastic motivations. But good motives do not guarantee good outcomes, let alone as much good as you could achieve. So when people say we should leave charities to it, satisfied by their objectives and their selflessness, and stop analysing them, I just cannot agree. Yes, we should admire charities for their dedication, but I don't think we should be happy with simply meaning well. It does not cut it. Let me propose instead that we need some creative destruction in the charity sector. There is some complacency out there, as I will go on to outline, just as there is some very good practice. If we want to identify one from the other and to encourage one over the other, then things are well overdue a shake-up. Charities seldom think about how effective they are at turning charitable funding and donated time into social outcomes. They are not generally under pressure from funders to start doing so either, but this is surely what they are all about. And the way they achieve this is broadly through what other sectors call productivity. Yet you rarely, if ever, hear this phrase used. It is little more than a four-letter word, as though sacrilegious to the very ethos of what it is to be involved in charities. Yet productivity and its close cousin, innovation, are crucially important. These two things are about using resources in the best way possible. The alternative is to accept achieving weaker outcomes for the people and causes you care about. And this needs to be dynamic too. We don't just want every charity doing the best it can with the way it works today. We also want innovation. This means constantly searching for new and better ways of, for example, organising the back office, or delivering interventions, or using social media for mentoring, or apps to help increase knowledge about constitutional rights in developing countries. So what is holding the charity sector back? Well, while passion and a fantastic sense of mission do drive activity, this is also an impediment to doing our very best at both the level of individual charities and for the sector as a whole. The desire to give and do often overwhelms the desire to achieve and constantly improve. But many other factors also play a part and hinder the creative destruction that is needed. I will focus on 6 today: funding, feedback loops, competition, governance, measurement and collaboration. First is the constant search for funding, the obsession of every charity chief exec. This ought to put an onus on charities to prove they do their job well. However, in practice, it mainly seems to drive innovation in fundraising techniques. As former Shell Foundation and Institute for Philanthropy boss Kurt Hoffman recently put it, when the best and brightest working in the charity sector are spending so much time fundraising, this happens at the expense of devoting conscious effort to innovating and improving performance, which is by far the most important source of value creation in every other product sector in our economy. But the problem on the funding sector side goes further, since most private, voluntary sector funders are not really trying to maximise return, in this case social return, for a given level of resources. They do want to have a positive social return and may undertake brief checks to ensure money is not being totally wasted, sequestered, or otherwise causing harm. But this is very different from searching out the most efficient organisations or innovative parts of the sector and putting money there. So there is limited pressure on charities from investors looking to invest in the best. Charities also suffer because of the tightness of the funding they receive and the fact that much is restricted to particular uses. Donors unhelpfully look at metrics to do with the percentage of money going straight to the beneficiary, which militates against longer-term developments. All this restrains charities from having the capacity to think about productivity and innovation. The funding regime contributes to a second problem of weak feedback loops, from funder to charity and vice versa, as well as between charities and their beneficiaries. Think of it like this. In most walks of life, you know pretty well if your performance is not up to scratch. The guy selling coffee for £3 a throw soon feels the power of a feedback loop when his customers report that his coffee tastes horrible and take their custom elsewhere, and his investors pull out because he is losing trade and money. For charities, the person who pays isn't the person who consumes, and charitable funders rarely move their funding because the charity is not doing as good a job as another. All this means that if we think of the charity sector as a system, there are no feedback loops driving us in the right direction. There is no invisible hand of market forces where beneficiaries go to a competitor if unhappy or funders support a clearly better charity to help calibrate the system in real time towards improving productivity and innovation. Nor does it happen as a result of citizens and users saying what they think very clearly and publicly, as they might in the public sector. With honourable exceptions, and despite the best efforts of many great charities, voice, not very powerful in the public sector, is often extremely faint in the charity world, especially important when the client can't really go anywhere else. In the absence of all this, charities focus on working out what the funder wants so as to guarantee their own survival, taking attention away from what they are achieving and what their beneficiaries need and want. We at MPC often hear from charities about funders giving in haphazard ways, asking for slightly different information to another funder for no good reason, not giving enough certainty on future funding, and so on. But this rarely reaches the ears of funders, because charities are keen to maintain their support. As Stanford University's Rob Reich puts it, people who become foundation officers are often surprised to find themselves transformed into the smartest and best-looking people in a room. This contributes to a third problem for the sector: too many entrances and not enough exits. The process of new charities starting up and others closing their doors does not work well in the sector, and when it does happen, it is not clear that the worst are replaced by new, better charities. Why do too few charities exit? Because it is possible to continue even if things are not going that well. As Professor Kimberly Scharf of Warwick University points out, although people start charities to solve a particular problem, they tend to try and keep them going even if another charity is doing a better job. The so-called warm glow effect that you get from doing things via your own charity outweighs the original motivation of doing good. So, you will only set up a donkey sanctuary if you really care about looking after donkeys. But will you ever close down your donkey sanctuary voluntarily if on all objective measures the sanctuary down the road is doing a better job? It's unsurprising then that mergers, never easy in any sector, are particularly rare in the charity sector. Without incentives to maximise value, in this case social value, it's not hard to see why mergers rarely come to pass. At the other end of the life cycle, it is fairly straightforward to launch a charity. There are few barriers to entry and often little need for much start-up capital. There is often less due diligence than a business start-up would get from a potential lender, so if someone is happy to give you the money, you're basically good to go. It then becomes harder to scale up for a whole set of reasons, so charities often operate below optimal size. One knock-on effect is that the bigger players have little reason to fear being pushed out by a bold new entrant in the way that the arrival of Microsoft forced IBM to completely transform. This guides the argument that at a sector level, we waste resources in aggregate because we have too many small charities. Of course, this needs to be set against the power of smaller charities, voluntary and community groups in dealing with specific issues, creating social capital, and securing the full commitment of their staff and supporters. But the basic point still stands. Competition of the traditional neoclassical kind does not help us much in this sector. So if these mechanisms do not work, are we rescued by governance? Well, here we come to a fourth issue. Governance in charities works in a very different way to other sectors. Questions about how the charity is performing and improving often get ignored in favour of topics which feel more urgent. What do our spreadsheets show us about the next month? Does our spend all come within Charity Commission guidelines? Are we financially sustainable? Add to this the voluntary, unpaid nature of trustee positions and the often unclear metrics around good performance, and the net result is that there is usually little pressure from the trustees of a charity or of a charitable funder to be high up what economists call the production possibility frontier, or to be pushing the boundaries on innovation. The fifth systemic problem underpinning a number of these other issues is that it is very hard to assess productivity in this sector. We do not have, and probably cannot have, an agreed measure of output akin to profitability, earnings per share, or even GDP in the private sector. This lack of an agreed numeraire or metric is a major problem, and one I will return to. Finally, and as a consequence of some of the factors already mentioned, collaboration is almost viscerally discouraged. This makes the sector much less productive than it could be overall. Most social issues are stubborn and complex, and finding a solution requires scale and concerted action from different groups working together. This means collaboration among charities and funders, yet we see very little of this in practice. The intense competition for resources creates pressures to bilateral relationships between funders and charities, and therefore a reduced appetite for comparative assessments and cooperation. I've explained a number of barriers to productivity and innovation. So, what is our response? One is, of course, to give up on this quest, maybe even to say that we do not care. The sector is about plurality, giving voice to marginalised people, the glue of civil society. It's about passionate people doing things of their own volition, outside the clutches either of the state or private for-profit interests. Surely charities have a right to exist, and for funders to bankroll them. As long as they do not cause harm, they should be left alone to act as they like. In any case, when all is said and done, the sector is a bit marginal and nice to have, and we should not beat ourselves up about its weaknesses. But this easy answer is unacceptable. Of course, the overall productivity of the charitable sector includes many things, going beyond the easily measurable aggregate impact of each charity. But this is not an excuse for each organisation to be less productive than it could be. I don't accept that there is a necessary trade-off. The passion that is core to charitable works does not disappear just because we try and work as well as we can. And the need is more urgent just now. As the state pulls back, for good and bad reasons, from helping some of the most vulnerable in society, as well as funding some of the more peripheral areas of life, like the arts and sport, the voluntary sector must deliver as much as it can with limited resources. In addition, we must not forget that many charities and community groups receive public money, not only directly, but through important tax advantages. This carries responsibilities. Resources are being given to the sector, and we owe it to the public to use these resources in the best way possible. So the search for doing better must be a priority. Although I now work in the charity sector with MPC, I have experience thinking about these issues in other sectors, and I want to consider if any of this can help us. Let me start with what drives private sector productivity and innovation, something I thought long and hard about, especially in my years running the economics team at think tank IPPR, and then as a special advisor at the Department of Trade and Industry. First, the dynamics of the market dictate that the best companies generally rise to the top. It's hard to hide behind poor performance. If you rest on your laurels, refuse to innovate, do not take up the latest technology, or respond to the changing tastes of your customers and clients, or price keenly for what you produce, then someone else will take your place. You may begin by losing or gaining market share, but this will ultimately lead to what economists call entry and exit. In general, the worst firms leave the market, go bust in normal language, while new ones replace them. To put this another way, if you want to know why no one goes to Wimpy anymore, look no further than McDonald's and Gourmet Burger. Work by Jonathan Haskell at Imperial College shows that this is incredibly important for productivity. It's not just about the weak leaving in a sort of Darwinian X-factor way, but to do with the fact that productivity is often developed by bold new entrants who smash the previous paradigm by bringing in new approaches and new innovations. These are the cutting-edge startups we should want to see coming through. The charities with big ideas and a commitment to measuring how well they are doing and publicly sharing their knowledge of what works and what doesn't. Second, shareholders put their money at risk and want to see a good financial return, so they have strong incentives to push the firm as far as it can go. And finally, all firms operate according to a general infrastructure, by which I mean education, training, physical infrastructure, often provided by or enabled by the public sector, but also agreed and policed standards, metrics, and regulatory structures. All these elements, external to the firm itself, give the right signals and enable innovation. This is all hard stuff to reproduce in the non-profit sector. One answer is to say that we need charities and others to behave more like their private sector counterparts. This explains why some are attracted to more commercial segments of the sector, social enterprise, social and impact investing, and for-profits with a social purpose. Here, we have different governance structures and encounter more of a commercial mindset, which means that, on the whole, they are better on risk, more customer-facing, and often take loan or quasi-equity type funding, which they have to pay back, bringing an element of discipline lacking when funding is via pure grants. The question still answered is whether social enterprises and the like are really an alternative to for-profit outfits and not an alternative to charities. I'll leave that thought hanging. So instead of capitulating to it, let's see what we can draw from the private sector experience. I previously mentioned that infrastructure matters in the private sector and that government sees a role for itself in helping. It would be nice if it did that in the voluntary sector too. A few grants and capacity building projects here and there don't go very far. In government, the business department and the Treasury worry about private sector productivity endlessly, while academics probe for better insights and ideas for action. There is a similar concern for public sector productivity, but also almost nobody really cares about it in the charity sector. More profoundly, the private sector dynamic works partly because there is an ability to compare firms and their products and services and allocate resource accordingly, whether you're a consumer or an investor. in the charity sector, the inability to know much about productivity and other metrics that allow you to see how a charity is doing is inevitably a great stumbling block. At its worst, charities have little or no idea of the effect they are having on the people they exist to help. Given the lack of internal forces pushing towards productivity, the concept of impact has grown up in the charity sector to try and provide grit to those looking to put productivity centre stage. Impact is not productivity, but it acts as a kind of proxy because it focuses on results and so allows you to work out the cost per unit of impact. Impact at the level of the individual charity starts, or should start in MPC's view, with what is known as a theory of change, a process of backwards mapping from your ultimate goal to the outcomes and activities needed to achieve it. After this, you can start to get a handle on how to measure what you achieve. This may start with the outputs you produce along the way, although not outcomes per se. Even counting this can be a big step forward for many, many charities. Measuring softer outcomes becomes harder still, but you can usually have a go. And even if you're an advocacy or campaigning organisation, it still makes sense to think about what doing a good job would look like and measuring yourself against that. Then there are issues around how much you actually contribute towards that outcome. This introduces the language of attribution, additionality, deadweight, displacement, and substitution. Purists say you can only address any of this with top-of-the-range methodology, copied from the medical world, randomised controlled trials, or RCTs. But these are not only expensive and often disproportionate, but can only get you so far in social policy. While a beautifully proven pill that works in one setting will probably work in another, an intervention for loneliness that works for a retired urban professional may well not work for a retired rural farm labourer. When you've assessed your impact, it becomes possible to look at trends across time and compare across different settings, youth clubs, schools, towns, cities, prisons, and against other interventions and organisations. And all of this is vital to any charity that seeks to do better. If you don't know how you're doing and how this is changing over time, you can never learn or improve. But it also starts to allow the external pressures that exist in the private sector to play some sort of role in the non-profit sector. Much of this work is up to the sector itself. Charities need to up their game when it comes to the measurement agenda and act on what it tells them, even when tough to stomach and resisted, as it will be, by trustees, volunteers, funders, and even some of the user group. But so too do charitable foundations and their representative bodies, plus the philanthropy advisors in private banks, in accountancy, and in legal firms. And if funders insisted on more impact measurement and made funding decisions based on whether a charity was at its best in class or was improving, then we would have a mechanism that drove productivity and effectiveness. Certainly there are, and always will be, funders who want to do minimal checking and give money out in a reactive way. But many are at least asking the questions, and at times even helping to support evaluation work. But government can also help press the case for decent measurement. It can support work to proselytise for impact measurement. It's already done this with the Inspiring Impact programme, where MPC leads a wide-ranging group of sector bodies, building support